Well, welcome everybody to another in our series of video chats that primarily intended for the Half Earth Project Educator Ambassador Program. This is really meant to give students and teachers some insight into conservation thinking, conservation action. And I have two great guests with me today who are involved with the Half Earth Project, and they're both experts in a particular aspect of the project that involves mapping and informatics to make, basically I'd say to improve conservation thinking and conservation decision making. So I'm gonna let them introduce themselves in a minute here, but first I wanna say, hi Jen, how are you doing?
Hi, doing well, thank you.
Good.
How are you?
I'm doing well too. Good to see you. And Scott, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Dennis. Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
Happy
good.
to be here.
That is somehow you're combining an interest in nature and ecology and conservation, and you're combining that with computing and mathematics and informatics thinking. So maybe, Jen, do you want to start off and tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Jennifer McGowan. I'm currently the Spatial Planning Technical Coordinator at the Nature Conservancy based here in Washington, D.C. I think probably my path to here started back in 6th grade when I went and visited Muir Woods, and it was really my first time. It's a park in Northern California, and it was my first time in nature, and I think it did have one of those transformative effects. And I knew at that point in time, you know, the field that I'm in now wasn't really an option. It didn't really exist, this idea of kind of geospatial conservation and conservation tech.
Yeah.
And so I pursued a degree in environmental studies because that seemed to be the most relevant to what I was interested in, which was, you know, nature conservation. And then I ended up going back to graduate school to learn GIS and get my master's degree in geography. And it was through the combination of geography and mapping and learning this sort of emerging technology at the time, which was geographic information systems, that led me into my PhD topic, which is about spatial conservation, planning, prioritization, and decision science. And through that, I started to learn about algorithms and different softwares that help support decision-making for conservation. And I've brought all of that with me now into my position at the Nature Conservancy, and I really help our strategies around the world try and prioritize action planning and spatial planning for nature and people.
That's great. No, boy, there's lots of things we could dig into. I love though that piece of the story, that 6th grade, those middle years can be really, I think they can be really critical. And you know, sadly, that's often when people decide like, you know, oh, I don't think I'm a science person, for example. So that time is really important. Thanks so much. How about you, Scott? What's your story?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels in my story with Jen's. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, so I actually bounced around between Oregon and Montana and Washington, and spent a lot of time outdoors with my family, did a lot of road trips around the area. It was always sort of an omnipresent background and always pretty readily accessible. And so I think from a very early age, I was taught an appreciation and reverence for the outdoors, and to foster my own personal connection with it. And so that's always been something that's been very special to me. Academically, as I grew up and sort of found my way through school, I found out very quickly that I was very interested and reasonably good at math and associated things. And so I got my undergraduate degree in pure mathematics. But when I decided to go on to graduate school, I really sort of began to wonder, you know, is there some way in which I could use these mathematical and quantitative skills that I have to apply them to some kind of environmental kind of science, like making the world better through math, you know?
Right.
And just like Jen said, I had absolutely no idea if such a field even existed. But it turned out that I found a program in quantitative ecology and resource management. And I went through graduate school there, got my PhD in sort of applications to landscape ecology, studying very broad patterns in space and time. Which brings me now to my current position as a research scientist at the Yale Center for Biodiversity and Global Change, and working on the Half-Earth Project in particular, and using conservation planning in order to figure out which half we need.
Yeah, well, that's great. And the project is so happy to have you. And even though Jen mentioned her primary appointment is with the Nature Conservancy, but also I know she's contributing through the Map of Life team at Yale, your team. She's going to be contributing a certain amount of her time directly to the Half-Earth Project. When I go around speaking, doing workshops and things, mostly for teachers and some with students, I always, the very first questions that come to anyone is why half and which half? And in part to turn, Ed Wilson's book, Half-Earth, to turn that into a project. One of the early things that the foundation did was to make the decision and raise funds to make this Half-Earth map. And all I wanted to do is point out the map, and that the three primary layers of this digital map are a biodiversity layer, an existing protection layer, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today, and then a human pressures layer.
What's helpful, I think, to think about is we use an analogy sometimes about building up a sports team. And if you were building a soccer team and you only tracked, you were evaluating players who were, trying to get on the team, and you only tracked how fast they could run. And so what you would end up with is a team of really fast runners, and you probably don't have a good goalie. And so this idea of building complementarity into how you pick players is exactly the same in how we want to think about our networks of protected areas. We want to make sure we have the best bits of everything, not just one type of system or iconic species.
Yeah.
And so
a deep bench. We want a deep bench.
Yeah, and so this idea of complementarity and representation, we've put this into something called the CARE principles, and these are fairly widely used. And basically it just means that, your network is a network, and the value of every site in that network is dependent on what else is in the network, what else is selected, just like a good team in sports. So connectivity is really important. You want to make sure that systems that are connected are protected. You don't want to just protect the mangroves that house the little fish larvae. You want to also make sure that the seagrass they have to migrate to the coral reefs, where they end up living out their adult lives and maturing, are also protected. So you have to make sure you're protecting all of their life history stages, not just one part of them. Adequacy has to do really with how much you protect. So is it enough to just protect one little patch of seagrass on one little island, or do we need to make sure we have enough of that habitat type to make sure that that species and system will persist through time? Representation, we've talked about a lot of. It really just means you want to have a good sample of all of the different facets of biodiversity. And efficiency speaks to the socioeconomics and the political realities that we are dealing with when we're thinking about designing networks of protected areas. So you might have a place that's very important, but it's also very important to a fishing ground, fishing community, or an industrial fleet. And so that's just trying to say we can't forget about those constraints as we're thinking about designing networks.
We want to start with this because any kind of solution that we're coming up with, we want to be able to recognize the work that's already been done on the landscape and be able to build from there, right? So we're not starting from scratch. We already have some portion of the landscape protected. And so we can use this and incorporate our second piece of data.
Right. Biodiversity.
Right, biodiversity. So getting back to the ideas of representation and whatever kind of targets or goals we're meeting here, I think that this is a really important point, that when we're talking about protecting half of the Earth, it's not just 50% of the surface area, right? We want to get the right 50% in order to preserve the biodiversity contained therein. Otherwise, it would be very easy, right? You just like grab Antarctica and Greenland, and we're already most of the way there.
More rock and ice, yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And so we really need to have an understanding of where the biodiversity is distributed across the landscape. And as you can see from this map of terrestrial vertebrate species, comprising amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles, there are about 32,000 species represented here. And you can see there's very uneven distribution. And that ends up mattering a whole heck of a lot, because going back to those goals that we had, let's say we want to preserve 17% as the target. It's not simply sufficient to protect 17% of every country or 17% of each ecoregion, because the biodiversity is distributed differently. Some ecoregions are more biodiverse than others. Do we really need 17% of rock and ice? Do we only need 17% of the rainforests? No, there's going to be a fair amount of variation in there. So we really need these patterns of biodiversity in order to meet our target of preserving it.
Conservation planning and the challenges that we're facing today require a really diverse group of skills. And so whether it's an interest in economics or in biology or even in social sciences, there is a role to play in this field, and we're stronger because of the diversity of minds that care. And so I think that we're in a position now more than ever before where it doesn't matter if you like mathematics or political science, you know, you can apply it and you can contribute to help solve these problems which are so desperately needed right now.
If we're looking to build a better world and translate our environmental science into outcomes like environmental action and environmental justice, that education is one of our most powerful tools that we have. And it's really about transforming and bringing up to speed the next generation and instilling these values and interests and passion in young minds, and helping them spread that message. So yeah, specifically, I want to say to the educators, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I think it's incredibly important.